"Find the sniper!" Marines shouted across the dense tree line, their voices carrying through the humid air like desperate prayers. The men knew someone was watching, waiting, as an unseen predator turned their routine mission into a deadly game of hide-and-seek. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The bullet sliced through the humid Florida air, missing Sergeant Collins's head by mere inches before embedding itself in the cypress trunk behind him. The entire platoon froze, instantly aware of their vulnerability in the open clearing. Collins dropped to his stomach, frantically signaling the others to take cover as another shot kicked up mud just feet from his position. Genesis Rodriguez remained perfectly still, her olive skin coated with swamp mud, her compact frame practically invisible among the reeds 800 meters from the chaos. Through her scope, she could see everything. The fear on her fellow Marines' faces, the subtle disturbance in vegetation that betrayed the enemy sniper's position, and the narrow window she had to act. Her breathing slowed methodically, a technique her grandfather had taught her in the Pyrenees years ago. For 6 long months at Forward Operating Base Evergreen, Genesis had been the radio girl, relegated to communications duty while Marines like Staff Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Jenkins ventured beyond the wire. Her technical innovations had extended their communication range by 40%, yet her compact frame and lack of combat experience had kept her confined to the base. No one had bothered to ask about her background or the skills she'd honed since childhood. The platoon's situation was deteriorating rapidly. 3 Marines were pinned down behind inadequate cover, and their standard counter-sniper tactics were failing. Through her earpiece, Genesis could hear Captain Morrison in the command center, his voice tense as he coordinated a response that would come too late. She adjusted her position slightly, compensating for the swamp's humidity and the gentle breeze that rippled across the water. The ghillie suit she'd secretly crafted from local vegetation made her indistinguishable from the surrounding environment. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger of her sniper rifle, a weapon she'd maintained in secret and practiced with during solitary excursions into the swamp. The communications specialist took one final breath, then exhaled halfway and held it. In this moment, all the dismissals, the exclusion from tactical planning, and the whispers about her size faded away. What remained was pure focus, the kind that had made her grandfather legendary in military circles. The rifle barely moved as she squeezed the trigger. 800 meters away, the enemy sniper's position went still. Before anyone could register what had happened, Genesis was already repositioning, moving silently through the water like a ghost. Her hidden talents would become the difference between life and death, and nothing at Forward Operating Base Evergreen would ever be the same again. Genesis Rodriguez was barely visible at the back of the briefing tent, her compact frame and Spanish features blending into the crowd of towering Marines. She preferred it this way, observing from the periphery where judgments were fewer and expectations minimal. At just 5 feet 4 inches and 115 pounds, she was often overlooked, her olive skin and dark eyes a reminder of childhood summers in the Pyrenees, and her upbringing in southern France before enlisting. The communication specialist stood silently as Captain Morrison outlined the day's objectives, noting how the other Marines unconsciously created space around her, not out of respect, but from the subtle dismissal that had become routine. Staff Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Jenkins exchanged knowing glances whenever she shifted position, their expressions suggesting she was out of place among real Marines. Outside Forward Operating Base Evergreen, the Florida swamplands stretched like an alien landscape, a maze of cypress trees and murky water that most of her unit viewed with disdain. Where they saw obstacles and danger, Genesis recognized opportunity. The terrain reminded her of hunting grounds, albeit wetter and more humid than the mountains where she'd learned to track and shoot. The swamp is a death trap, she overheard Jenkins telling a group of newer Marines, "You can't move without making noise. Can't see more than 20 meters, and everything wants to kill you." Genesis bit her tongue. She could navigate that death trap better than anyone realized. During her limited free time, she'd ventured beyond the perimeter, mapping pathways and memorizing landmarks. The skills honed while tracking game with her grandfather high in the French mountains translated perfectly to this environment: patience, observation, and moving without disturbing the natural rhythm of a place. Rachel Chun, one of the few who occasionally acknowledged her, nudged Genesis gently. "You're doing that thing again," she whispered. "What thing?" Genesis asked, focusing back on the briefing. "That look, like you know something no one else does." She did know something, that the terrain everyone feared could become their greatest advantage. But experience had taught her that offering unsolicited insights only reinforced her outsider status. Instead, she nodded politely as Morrison dismissed the group, watching as her fellow Marines gathered their gear for another patrol that would exclude her. The irony wasn't lost on Genesis. In the Pyrenees, her grandfather had taught her that being small meant being invisible when necessary, an advantage no bulky soldier could claim. Here, that same stature had become her prison, confining her to communication duties while others ventured beyond the wire. As she headed toward the communications bunker, she wondered how long she would remain invisible before someone finally saw what she could truly offer. Captain Morrison's morning briefing unfolded with predictable precision in the stuffy confines of the briefing tent. Maps were spread across the makeshift table, coffee cups balanced precariously on equipment cases as the captain's finger traced across the terrain. "Intelligence suggests increased sniper activity in sectors 4 and 7, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We've had 3 near misses in the past week alone." Genesis Rodriguez leaned forward from her position at the back of the group, her eyes tracking every contour line and elevation marker on the map. The swampland's intricate network of waterways and dense vegetation wasn't just abstract topography to her, it was familiar territory. During countless off-duty hours, she had meticulously explored these areas, memorizing sightlines and natural hide positions that would make perfect sniper nests. "This ridge here provides cover for approach," she thought, recognizing a formation she had crawled across just 3 days prior. The communications specialist noted how the morning sun would create blinding glare from the east, tactical information absent from the official assessment. As the briefing concluded, Captain Morrison began distributing assignments. Staff Sergeant Martinez will lead Alpha Team through the northern approach. The seasoned Marine nodded, already mentally preparing for the dangers ahead. "Corporal Jenkins, you'll take Bravo along this southern route." Jenkins accepted with the confidence of someone accustomed to being trusted with critical missions. One by one, the captain assigned roles to those deemed combat-ready. Genesis stood motionless, her olive complexion betraying nothing of her inner thoughts as she awaited her inevitable assignment. "Rodriguez," Morrison finally said, barely looking up from his clipboard. "Communications maintenance as usual. We're having issues with the Eastern Relay. Fix it." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the familiar sting of exclusion. 23 consecutive missions relegated to base duties, while others faced danger and earned respect beyond the wire. As the group dispersed, Genesis caught fragments of conversation between Jenkins and Martinez. "Wouldn't want Radio Girl out there anyway," the corporal muttered. "Too small to carry your own gear, let alone help if things go sideways." The communications specialist gathered her notes, her face a practiced mask of professional detachment. They didn't know about her marksmanship, her terrain knowledge, or how she could move through the swamp without disturbing a single leaf. They saw only what they expected. A technical specialist, not a warrior. Genesis headed toward the communications bunker, mentally reviewing the relay system she would repair. Again, while the real mission happened without her. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Patience is a hunter's greatest weapon. She would continue waiting for her moment, invisible but ready. As the patrol team gathered their equipment near the command center, Genesis Rodriguez stood apart, checking her radio equipment one last time. She caught fragments of conversation from Staff Sergeant Martinez and 3 other Marines huddled by the transport vehicle. "I don't get why she even enlisted," Martinez muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "One firefight and she'd be a liability. Too small, too green." Corporal Jenkins nodded in agreement. "Communications is where she belongs. At least there she can't get anyone killed." Genesis pretended not to hear as she adjusted her headset, but the words stung more than she cared to admit. 6 months at Forward Operating Base Evergreen, and still they saw only her physical limitations. No one mentioned how her signal amplification modifications had extended their communication range by 40%, allowing patrols to venture deeper into contested territory while maintaining contact. "Ready to roll out," Martinez called, deliberately making eye contact with everyone except Genesis. The communications specialist watched them climb into the patrol vehicle, their muscular frames weighed down with combat gear. In their world, a Marine's value was measured in pounds of muscle and inches of height. At 5'4" and 115 pounds, Genesis would always fall short by those metrics. The irony tasted bitter as she returned to the communications bunker. Back in the Pyrenees, hunting with her grandfather, her size had been her greatest advantage. She could slip through dense underbrush without disturbing a single leaf. Her lightweight frame allowed her to reach vantage points others couldn't access. Her grandfather had praised her natural talent, calling her the ghost for her ability to move undetected and strike with precision. "You don't need size to be deadly," he'd told her, adjusting her grip on his old hunting rifle. "You need patience, intelligence, and the ability to become invisible." Genesis glanced out at the swampland beyond the base perimeter. The terrain wasn't so different from the mountain forests where she'd trained. Both required careful movement, attention to detail, and respect for the environment. She knew she could navigate those wetlands better than most of the bulky Marines who crashed through them like wounded bears. But here, those skills remained invisible, overshadowed by the military's rigid definition of combat readiness. Her olive skin and dark eyes, inherited from her Spanish mother, only reinforced her outsider status among the predominantly white and black Marines. Genesis settled at her station, switching on the monitoring equipment. She would continue to do her job with excellence, even as her true potential remained unseen. Someday, she thought, they would understand that real strength wasn't always visible to the naked eye. After the patrol left, Genesis Rodriguez settled into the communications bunker, surrounded by the hum of equipment she kept running in the corrosive swamp air. The constant battle against moisture and heat was one she fought daily to maintain their lifeline to command. Her fingers moved deftly across dials and switches, running diagnostics that had become second nature over months of service. Through the small reinforced window, Genesis saw what others missed. Where her fellow Marines viewed only a hostile environment of murky water and tangled vegetation, she recognized a landscape filled with natural shooting positions and hidden paths. The cypress knees jutting from shallow water would provide perfect stability for a rifle. That fallen oak created a natural shooting lane with 300 meters of clear visibility. The subtle rise 2 clicks east offered commanding views of approach routes to the base. Her notebook, carefully stashed beneath her gear, told the real story of her time at Evergreen. Page after meticulously drawn page detailed every range card, wind pattern, and firing lane within 2 miles of the base. The communications specialist had mapped terrain features that even seasoned reconnaissance teams had overlooked, noting how morning fog settled in certain depressions or how afternoon thermals affected bullet drop across the swamp. "Communications check, Bravo team," she spoke into her headset, receiving the expected confirmation from Staff Sergeant Martinez. The exchange was brief and professional, betraying nothing of the dismissive comments he had made about her that morning. She had spent countless hours mapping the terrain during off-duty time, slipping away when others relaxed or slept. Sometimes she would lie motionless for hours, observing wildlife patterns that revealed hidden pathways through seemingly impassable sections of swamp. Each notation was precise, each calculation double-checked against her training. The young Marine was driven by an instinct that someday her unseen preparations would matter. Perhaps it was her grandfather's voice in her memory, teaching her that preparation often meant the difference between success and failure in the field. Patience is a hunter's greatest weapon, he would say during those long afternoons in the Pyrenees. Each day at the communications console was another exercise in patience, waiting for a chance to prove that her knowledge was more than theoretical. Genesis adjusted her headset and continued monitoring transmissions, her dark eyes occasionally drifting to the window and the swamp beyond, a terrain she had come to understand better than anyone at Forward Operating Base Evergreen realized. The rejection letter sat on Genesis Rodriguez's bunk, its formal language barely concealing Captain Morrison's irritation. Request denied. Communication specialists are not eligible for advanced tactical training at this time. 3 weeks into her deployment at Forward Operating Base Evergreen, and already her third attempt at cross-training had been shut down. Your job is communications, not combat operations. Stay in your lane, Rodriguez. Morrison had told her directly when she'd pressed the issue. His tone made it clear further discussion would be unwelcome. From her first day at Evergreen, Genesis had found herself systematically excluded from anything resembling combat preparation. While Marines like Staff Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Jenkins received advanced tactical briefings, she was assigned to inventory radio components and update communication protocols. The pattern was unmistakable and intentional. What frustrated her most was that her actual contributions went beyond her assigned role. Her redesign of the base's communication relay system had extended their operational range by 40%. When tropical storms had knocked out satellite connections, she'd engineered a workaround that kept vital intelligence flowing. Problems that had stumped the previous communications team for months, she'd solved in days. Yet these achievements earned her nothing but verbal praise. "Excellent work, Rodriguez," they'd say, before immediately returning her to the communications bunker. No additional responsibilities, no expanded role. No recognition that translated into opportunity. The turning point came during the monthly marksmanship competition. Genesis had submitted her name, hoping to at least demonstrate one skill that might change perceptions. She'd arrived at the range early, mentally preparing for the course. "Rodriguez, there must be some mistake," Lieutenant Colonel Bradford had said, checking his clipboard. "This is a combat proficiency exercise." "I'm aware, sir. I'd like to participate." Several Marines nearby had exchanged glances. Jenkins had barely suppressed a laugh. "No offense, but have you ever even fired anything beyond a pistol qual?" Before she could answer, Bradford had waved his hand dismissively. "The communications bunker needs someone on duty anyway. That's where you'll be most useful." Walking away, Genesis had heard Martinez mutter, "What would Radio Girl do in a real firefight anyway? Call for help?" The memory still burned. Her grandfather's lessons in the Pyrenees, tracking game across mountain terrain, calculating wind drift at 800 meters, remaining motionless for hours. All these skills meant nothing here. Her experience was deemed irrelevant, her potential contribution dismissed before she could demonstrate it. That night, Genesis had made a decision. If the system wouldn't recognize what she could offer, she would prepare anyway. She would train alone, map the terrain herself, and be ready when, not if, the moment came to prove them all wrong. What her unit didn't know was that Genesis Rodriguez had been shooting since she was 8, taught by her grandfather, a retired French military sniper who had passed down generations of knowledge with patient hands. The old man had recognized something in his granddaughter's eyes, a stillness, a focus that couldn't be taught. During those formative summers in the Pyrenees, he had shown her how to become invisible against the mountain backdrop, how to control her breathing until her heartbeat barely registered, and how to read the wind through subtle movements of grass and leaves. "Patience is a sniper's greatest weapon," he would whisper, as they lay motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. Genesis had internalized these lessons, developing an instinctive understanding of terrain that translated perfectly to the Florida swamplands. The murky waters and dense vegetation that frustrated her fellow Marines felt oddly familiar to her. Just another landscape to read and master. Her grandfather had taught her that smaller frames often made better marksmen. "Less surface area means less movement," he'd explained, while adjusting her grip on the rifle. "Your size is not a weakness, it's an advantage." In the mountains, Genesis had proven him right, tracking game with uncanny precision and taking shots that experienced hunters missed. But military culture at Forward Operating Base Evergreen operated on different principles. Captain Morrison and Staff Sergeant Martinez valued demonstrated performance in standardized settings, range qualifications, combat simulations, physical fitness tests, where Genesis's unconventional strengths remained invisible. Her stature became her defining characteristic, not her skills. The bias manifested in 100 small ways. During equipment distribution, Corporal Jenkins would automatically hand her lighter loads without asking. In tactical discussions, her suggestions about alternative firing positions were acknowledged with polite nods before conversation continued as if she hadn't spoken. Even Rachel Chun, who had initially seemed supportive, began to adopt the unit's protective stance toward the communication specialist. Most painful were the patrol assignments, where Genesis was consistently passed over in favor of larger, more physically imposing Marines. The implicit message was clear. She needed protection rather than being trusted to protect others. When dangerous missions arose, she watched from the communications bunker as others shouldered the risks and built the bonds that came with shared danger. Her grandfather would have laughed at their assumptions. He had taught her that true strength in combat came from discipline, observation, and precision, not merely physical power. But here, among the Marines of Forward Operating Base Evergreen, those lessons remained her private knowledge, a secret advantage waiting for the moment when it might finally matter. Excluded from combat operations, Genesis Rodriguez channeled her frustration into a personal mission. While her fellow Marines slept or relaxed during downtime, the communications specialist slipped away to map the treacherous Florida swampland surrounding Forward Operating Base Evergreen. Each expedition yielded valuable intelligence, terrain features, natural shooting positions, and potential enemy hiding spots, all meticulously documented in her worn notebook. She developed a routine that became almost meditative. During early mornings, Genesis would analyze satellite imagery borrowed from the intelligence office, comparing official maps with her own observations. The young Marine taught herself to read subtle signs of human activity, broken vegetation, disturbed mud patterns, and unnatural shadows that might indicate enemy presence. Her grandfather's lessons from the Pyrenees proved invaluable as she adapted mountain tracking techniques to the human swamp environment. Stay invisible, move with purpose. She would whisper to herself, practicing movement techniques designed to traverse. She perfected methods of sliding through cypress stands and navigating soggy terrain that would have left others hopelessly stuck or noisily exposed. Each small success fueled her determination to master this hostile environment. The irony wasn't lost on her. While officially restricted to maintaining communication equipment inside the safety of the base, Genesis had likely accumulated more reconnaissance data than any patrol. Her notebook contained detailed range cards, wind patterns, and optimal firing positions that could prove invaluable during operations. Yet this knowledge remained her secret burden, unshared and unutilized. During rare moments of downtime in the communications bunker, She would overhear Marines discussing patrols and the challenges they faced. Staff Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Jenkins would return frustrated by their inability to navigate certain areas or locate potential sniper nests. Genesis would bite her tongue, knowing she had mapped those exact locations days earlier. Just the radio girl, someone had called her last week, the dismissal stinging more than she cared to admit. Her colleagues saw only the quiet technician who kept their communications running smoothly, competent at her assigned task, but presumed incapable of real Marine work. They never questioned how she maintained equipment so effectively in the corrosive swamp environment, or noticed the mud occasionally caked under her fingernails. The waste of her potential was what hurt most. Genesis knew she could provide intelligence that would keep her units safer, potentially saving lives, but in a culture that valued demonstrated performance over claimed abilities, her unofficial reconnaissance remained invisible. Just like her, she continued anyway, driven by quiet determination and the certainty that someday this knowledge would matter. The military's rigid structure had no category for someone like Genesis Rodriguez. Sitting at her communications console, she monitored the routine radio chatter, while Lieutenant Colonel Bradford and Major Hawkins discussed the day's operations just feet away. They spoke of terrain challenges as if the swamp was an unknowable enemy, while Genesis mentally corrected their assumptions based on her meticulous observations. "Sector 6 is too waterlogged for effective movement," Bradford stated confidently, pointing to a map region Genesis knew contained 3 traversable pathways invisible on standard topography. She bit her tongue, knowing her input would be dismissed as overreach from a communications specialist. The irony wasn't lost on her. While seasoned Marines like Staff Sergeant Martinez ventured into small sections of the swampland on scheduled patrols, Genesis had systematically mapped the entire operational area during her off hours. Their fragmented understanding came from disconnected experiences, while her comprehensive knowledge remained untapped, filed away in the notebook hidden beneath her bunk. The eastern approach to Checkpoint Charlie needs reinforcement, Captain Morrison announced in the morning briefing. Genesis silently noted how the captain missed the natural depression 200 meters south that offered perfect concealment for an enemy observer, a spot she'd identified weeks ago. Where her fellow Marines saw chaos in the Florida wetlands, she recognized patterns. The solid ground patches perfect for prone shooting positions, the cypress clusters that provided natural concealment but also created predictable movement corridors, the seasonal water level changes that transformed impassable sections into viable infiltration routes. "Radio check, Checkpoint Bravo," came the crackling voice of Corporal Jenkins. "Confirmed, Bravo." Genesis responded professionally, maintaining the communication network, while her mind calculated wind patterns affecting long-range shooting in the sector Jenkins was patrolling. Her fingers tapped methodically on the communication device, her expertise acknowledged only within the narrow confines of her assigned role. The operations center hummed with activity around her, but she remained peripheral, a technical asset rather than a tactical one. Genesis watched Rachel Chun prepare for patrol, strapping on equipment for a reconnaissance mission. Once, she'd tried to share her terrain analysis with Rachel, but even this former confidant had gently suggested she focus on her assigned duties. The communications specialist turned back to her console, the isolation familiar but no less painful. The system valued what it could measure and categorize: physical strength, combat experience, proven performance under fire, leaving her unconventional skills unacknowledged. She monitored the frequencies, maintaining the invisible threads connecting the Marines in the field, while her most valuable contributions remained theoretical, untested, and unseen. In the dim light of the communications bunker, Genesis Rodriguez sat alone, surrounded by the steady hum of equipment she had meticulously maintained. The morning's report on unusual enemy radio traffic patterns lay beside her keyboard, stamped, reviewed, but without follow-up instructions. It was the third such analysis this month to disappear into the bureaucratic void. The base valued her work in concrete, measurable ways: uptime percentages, transmission clarity, equipment functionality. When communications worked flawlessly, no one noticed. When they failed, everyone complained. Her technical innovations had extended their operational range beyond the window. The swap stretched into the distance. While others saw only danger and discomfort, Genesis saw a tactical chessboard. She had mapped every elevation change, noted seasonal water levels, and calculated firing solutions from dozens of potential positions. This morning, she'd spotted signs of movement in Sector 6, subtle disturbances in the vegetation pattern that suggested human activity. She documented it meticulously, knowing the information would likely join her other reports in administrative limbo. In the mess hall, laughter erupted from a table where Staff Sergeant Martinez was recounting yesterday's patrol. The communications specialist watched from her corner table, separated by more than just physical distance. When Private Thompson called out, "Hey Rodriguez, you're missing the story," she smiled politely, but remained where she was, knowing the invitation was more courtesy than inclusion. The evening found her alone in her quarters, reviewing her private reconnaissance notes. While her fellow Marines bonded over card games and shared experiences, Genesis prepared for a day that might never come. She'd missed movie night 3 weeks running, and the birthday celebration for Corporal Jenkins last Friday. Rachel Chun had stopped inviting her altogether, assuming she'd decline. "You're always working on something," Rachel had said the last time they'd really talked. "Don't you ever just want to relax?" Genesis couldn't explain that her work wasn't just work, it was preparation, purpose, the thing that would matter when everything else failed. How could she describe the clarity she felt mapping terrain others avoided, or the certainty that someday these skills would be needed? The solitude was a price she willingly paid. In the Pyrenees with her grandfather, she had learned that patience was as crucial as precision. The perfect shot might require hours of waiting, and the hunter who moved too soon always returned empty-handed. So Genesis waited, preparing for her moment with quiet determination, sustaining herself with the belief that someday, perhaps when least expected, her preparation would make the difference between life and death for the very people who now overlooked her. What had once been considered mere enthusiasm quickly transformed into something more sinister. Genesis Rodriguez's detailed intelligence summary, documenting enemy movement patterns, terrain vulnerabilities, and communication blind spots, landed on Captain Morrison's desk with a thud that echoed through the command structure. 3 days later, Genesis found herself seated in Morrison's office, facing not just the captain, but also Major Hawkins and Lieutenant Colonel Bradford. The room felt smaller than usual, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. "Explain how you obtained this intelligence," Morrison demanded, tapping the folder with his index finger. His tone suggested this wasn't a request for clarification, but an interrogation. Genesis explained her methods: careful observation, pattern analysis, and connecting dots from radio chatter. But with each explanation, the officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. "This goes well beyond your clearance level," Major Hawkins noted coldly. "Communications specialists don't conduct independent intelligence gathering." Lieutenant Colonel Bradford leaned forward. "Your curiosity could compromise operational security. How do we know you haven't shared these observations with unauthorized personnel?" What Genesis had seen as initiative was being reframed as dangerous overreach. Her dedication to protecting her fellow Marines had somehow become a liability. The following week, Security Brief Staff Sergeant Martinez delivered pointed reminders about maintaining role boundaries and staying in your lane, his eyes finding Genesis in the crowd. The message couldn't have been clearer if her name had been explicitly mentioned. Access to intelligence reports she'd previously consulted was suddenly restricted. Equipment requests that had once been routine now required multiple signatures and justifications. Genesis noticed Staff Sergeant Martinez watching her movements around the base, his observations thinly disguised as casual encounters. Even more painful was the social isolation that followed. Marines who had shared meals with her now found reasons to sit elsewhere. Conversations stopped when she approached. Rachel Chun, once a confidant during long night shifts, grew distant and guarded. "I need to focus on my duties," Rachel explained awkwardly when Genesis asked if something was wrong. "Maybe you should too." Private Thompson's seemingly innocent questions about her background in France felt like reconnaissance rather than friendly interest. "Your grandfather was military? What exactly did he teach you about tracking?" Genesis maintained her composure, but each night in her quarters, the isolation weighed heavier. The communications bunker, once her domain, now felt like a prison of suspicion. Every radio transmission she monitored, every maintenance log she completed, all scrutinized for signs of overreach. The message was unmistakable. Her value to the Marines would be measured by her compliance, not her capabilities. And in a system built on trust, she had somehow become the outsider within. Genesis Rodriguez felt the weight of every glance as she crossed the mess hall. The usual background chatter fell to whispers whenever she approached. What had once been a sense of belonging had transformed into something far more isolating. "There she goes again," Staff Sergeant Martinez muttered, loud enough for Genesis to hear as she passed his table. "Always watching, always taking notes. That's not what comm specialists are supposed to do." Corporal Jenkins nodded in agreement. "Command's right to keep an eye on her. Something's not right about someone who spends that much time mapping terrain when it's not their job." Genesis kept her face neutral, a skill she'd perfected during childhood hunts in the Pyrenees. She collected her food and found an empty table, acutely aware of the invisible barrier that had formed around her. The isolation stung worse than any physical wound. Later that afternoon, Private Thompson cornered her outside the communications bunker. His questions seemed casual at first, but Genesis quickly recognized the pattern. "So you grew up in France? That's interesting. Your grandfather was military, right? What exactly did he do?" Thompson leaned against the doorframe, blocking her exit. "Must have been pretty specialized work to teach you all that tracking stuff you mentioned once." "Just basic infantry," she lied, knowing her grandfather's sniper background would only fuel suspicions. "Nothing special." That evening, Rachel Chun, the one person Genesis had considered a friend, pulled her aside after shift change. The concern in Rachel's eyes told Genesis everything before she spoke a word. "You need to be more careful about how things look," Rachel whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "People are talking. Morrison's watching you specifically now. Jenkins says they're reviewing your file, checking your background more thoroughly." "I'm just trying to help," Genesis replied, her voice barely audible. Rachel shook her head. "That's not how they see it. Your initiative, your reconnaissance, they're calling it overreach. Some even use the word suspicious." She squeezed Genesis's arm. "I believe in you, but I can't be seen. You know." The unfinished sentence hung between them, its meaning devastatingly clear. Even Rachel was distancing herself. Walking back to her quarters alone, Genesis finally understood the full implications. Everything that made her valuable, her attention to detail, her initiative, her dedication, was being reframed as dangerous. Her abilities weren't seen as assets but as threats to the established order. The realization settled like ice in her stomach. She had become the outsider she'd always feared being. Worse, she was now viewed not just as different, but potentially dangerous, a threat to unit cohesion rather than an untapped resource. Genesis Rodriguez stood rigidly at attention in Captain Morrison's office, the afternoon sun casting harsh shadows across the small space. 3 stern faces regarded her from behind the makeshift tribunal desk. Morrison himself, Major Hawkins with his perpetually furrowed brow, and Lieutenant Colonel Bradford. whose presence signaled the seriousness of the situation. "Specialist Rodriguez, do you understand why you're here?" Morrison began, his voice measured but cold. "Yes, sir," Genesis replied, keeping her gaze fixed on the wall behind them. Major Hawkins leaned forward. "You've been operating well beyond your assigned responsibilities. Unauthorized reconnaissance, accessing intelligence outside your... We have reports of you mapping terrain features during off hours. Care to explain?" Genesis took a deep breath. "Sir, I was attempting to improve our operational awareness. The maps we're using don't account for seasonal changes in the swampland. I noticed discrepancies that could affect patrol safety." "That's not your job," Bradford interjected, his voice cutting through the room. "Your assignment is communications maintenance, not intelligence gathering. You've deliberately circumvented the chain of command." "With respect, sir, I was trying to contribute." "By undermining established protocols?" Morrison interrupted. "Your actions suggest you believe yourself above the system that keeps this unit functioning." The communications specialist felt her throat tighten. Every explanation she offered seemed to dig her deeper into trouble. Her initiative, once a point of pride, was being reframed as dangerous insubordination. "Staff Sergeant Martinez reports you've been asking detailed questions about patrol routes," Hawkins continued. "Corporal Jenkins noted your unusual interest in sniper positions. These aren't concerns for someone in your role." Genesis realized with growing dismay that her colleagues had been reporting on her. Even casual conversations had been scrutinized and found suspicious. "I understand how this appears," she said carefully, "but my intentions were to protect our Marines." Bradford shook his head. "Your intentions don't matter when your actions compromise operational security. This isn't about your capabilities, Specialist. It's about order and discipline." The tribunal deliberated briefly before Morrison delivered their verdict. An official reprimand would be entered into her record. She was restricted to base, confined to the communications bunker except for meals and sleep. Any further unauthorized activities would result in more severe consequences. Genesis saluted crisply, but inside she felt hollow. As she turned to leave, Morrison added, "Rodriguez, you're walking a dangerous line. One more misstep and you'll face discharge. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," she replied, knowing her military career now hung by the thinnest of threads. The emergency alarm sliced through the morning air, its shrill wail shattering the routine at Forward Operating Base Evergreen. Genesis Rodriguez dropped her equipment and froze, recognizing the distinct pattern that signaled active hostiles. 3 short bursts, followed by 1 long. Enemy snipers had launched a coordinated attack. "Marines down at Charlie." The first transmission crackled through the communications system. "Taking fire from elevated positions. Can't locate shooter." Within seconds, Checkpoint Bravo reported similar circumstances. The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions, each more urgent than the last. "2 wounded. Need immediate evac. Pinned down. Can't move. Request counter-sniper team ASAP." Genesis sprinted toward the operations center, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside, Captain Morrison stood rigid before a tactical display, his face etched with tension as he barked orders into a handset. Major Hawkins and Lieutenant Colonel Bradford huddled nearby, their expressions grim as situation reports flooded in. "Enemy has perfect sightlines on both checkpoints." Morrison growled. "How did we miss this?" Genesis felt her throat tighten. The positions being described, a cypress ridge overlooking Bravo, an abandoned structure with clear lines to Charlie, were exactly what she had documented in her private reconnaissance. She had mapped these vulnerabilities months ago, noting their tactical advantages and potential countermeasures. Staff Sergeant Martinez burst through the door, his uniform soaked with swamp water. "Sir, we can't advance. Every time we move, they adjust fire. It's like they know the terrain better than we do." Genesis stepped forward instinctively, then caught herself. The reprimand from her tribunal still hung over her like a guillotine. Speaking up now would be seen as another act of insubordination, potentially ending her military career. Yet Marines were bleeding out there. People she knew, people she cared about. Through the command center window, she could see medical teams preparing for casualties. Private Thompson was loading supplies onto a transport vehicle, his movements frantic. In the distance, the dull thud of gunfire continued unabated. Weather report shows a storm front moving in, Rachel Chun announced from the communications station. Helicopter support will be impossible in 45 minutes. Captain Morrison slammed his fist on the table. Standard counter-sniper protocols aren't working. These shooters know exactly where to hide. Genesis bit her lip until she tasted blood. Every second of hesitation could cost another life. The knowledge she possessed, terrain features, approach vectors, concealment options, could save her fellow Marines. But using that knowledge meant admitting to unauthorized reconnaissance and disobeying direct orders. As the radio crackled with another desperate call for help, Genesis watched the command team scramble for solutions that she already had. The choice before her was impossible: preserve her career by staying silent or risk everything to save lives. The command center erupted in chaos as reports flooded in. 3 Marines were down at Checkpoint Charlie, with Staff Sergeant Martinez desperately calling for medical evacuation. The Florida sky had darkened ominously, threatening the approaching storm that would ground all helicopters within the hour. "We can't locate the shooters," Captain Morrison barked into his communication device. "They're moving between positions. Every time we think we have them, they're gone." Genesis Rodriguez stood silently at her communication station, her fingers trembling slightly as she plotted the reported shots on her mental map. The pattern was unmistakable. The enemy was using the elevated cypress grove she had documented during her unauthorized explorations 3 weeks ago. "We need to get our wounded out now," Major Hawkins insisted, pointing at the weather radar. "That storm front will make air support impossible in 45 minutes. The command center buzzed with increasingly desperate suggestions. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford ordered a suppression barrage, but the shooters remained untouchable, protected by the natural fortress of swampland and dense vegetation. Genesis watched as her fellow Marines proposed solutions that would fail. She knew exactly where the snipers were positioned, in the same locations she had identified as optimal firing positions during her solitary reconnaissance missions. The shooters were using the natural channels she had mapped, moving between 3 specific locations that offered both concealment and clear lines of fire. A crackling transmission cut through the noise. "This is Jenkins. Thompson's hit. We need immediate support." Genesis closed her eyes, weighing her options. Speaking up meant admitting to her unauthorized activities, a career-ending move after her recent reprimand. Staying silent meant more Marines would die. The radio crackled again with Martinez's voice, desperate and strained. "We can't move. They have perfect sight lines on our position." Genesis stepped forward, her decision made. The lives of her fellow Marines outweighed her career aspirations. She approached the tactical display where Morrison and the senior officers huddled. "Sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her racing heart, "I know where those shooters are positioned." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the communications specialist, the woman they had dismissed as unfit for combat operations. "How could you possibly know that?" Bradford demanded. Genesis straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "Because I've mapped every inch of that terrain. I know exactly where they're shooting from, and I know how to reach." "But right now, Marines are dying, and I can help stop it." A stunned silence fell over the command center as Genesis Rodriguez's words hung in the air. Faces turned toward the petite communications specialist with expressions ranging from disbelief to suspicion. "How exactly would you know their positions when our reconnaissance teams can't find them?" Captain Morrison demanded, his voice tight with skepticism. Genesis stepped forward, her olive skin flushed with determination. "I've been mapping the entire swamp during my off hours, sir. I know every vantage point within 2 miles of base." She pulled her worn notebook from her pocket and spread it open on the tactical table, revealing meticulously detailed terrain sketches. "These 3 elevated positions, here, here, and here," she pointed, "offer perfect firing lanes to both checkpoints. The shooters are using natural concealment that your teams wouldn't recognize unless they've studied the seasonal vegetation patterns. Major Hawkins leaned over the notebook, eyes narrowing. "And you gathered this intelligence without authorization?" "Yes, sir," Genesis admitted. "I documented everything: approach routes, escape paths, firing positions. I can reach them without being detected." Lieutenant Colonel Bradford crossed his arms. "You're a communications specialist, Rodriguez, not a sniper, not reconnaissance." "With respect, sir, I was trained by my grandfather, a retired French military sniper. I've been shooting since I was 8 years old. The terrain is similar to the Pyrenees, where I grew up hunting." Staff Sergeant Martinez scoffed. "This isn't a hunting trip in France." "No," Genesis agreed, her voice steady. "It's more important. Those are our people dying out there." "All right." The radio crackled with another desperate transmission. "We've got 2 more wounded. Cannot establish shooter position. Need immediate assistance." Genesis met Captain Morrison's gaze. "I have the skills, I have the knowledge, and I have a precision rifle and camouflage suit ready." She traced a finger along her planned infiltration route. "I can neutralize all 3 positions within the hour." "Absolutely not," Morrison said firmly. "You have no official sniper training, no combat experience, and no one else who can reach those positions without being seen," Genesis countered. "Every minute we debate, our people remain pinned down." The captain shook his head. "Too risky. We'll wait for air support." "The weather front will ground helicopters within 30 minutes, she replied, pointing to the meteorological display. "Sir, I'm not asking for permission to try. I'm telling you I can succeed." Morrison studied her for a long moment, weighing protocol against necessity. "Stand down, specialist. That's an order." Genesis straightened, her expression unreadable. "Understood, sir." As she turned to leave, another transmission broke through, a Marine screaming for medical evacuation. In that moment, Genesis made her decision. She would face the consequences later, but she would not stand by while her fellow Marines died. Genesis Rodriguez nodded as if accepting Captain Morrison's order to stand down, but her mind was already calculating trajectories and wind speeds. The moment she left the command center, she sprinted not toward the communications bunker, but to her quarters. With practiced hands, she unlocked a hidden compartment beneath her bunk, where her M24 sniper rifle lay disassembled, a weapon she'd maintained in secret for months. 3 minutes, she whispered to herself, assembling the precision rifle with fluid motions. Her fingers worked independently of conscious thought, muscle memory from countless hours of practice guiding each movement. From the same hiding place, she retrieved her ghillie suit, carefully designed to match the specific vegetation of the Florida swampland. The young Marine scribbled a detailed note explaining her plan, including coordinates of the enemy positions and her intended approach route. She left it prominently on her bed, insurance in case things went wrong. Genesis knew the consequences would be severe, but the radio chatter reporting wounded Marines left no room for hesitation. Dressed in her camouflage and with her rifle secured, she slipped through the maintenance gate at the eastern perimeter, a weak point she'd identified during her unauthorized explorations. The guards were focused on the crisis unfolding at the checkpoints, allowing her to vanish into the swamp undetected. The terrain that intimidated most Marines felt almost welcoming to her. Each step was deliberate, placing her weight on solid ground to avoid leaving tracks or creating noise. The communications specialist moved like water through the cypress trees, her small frame an advantage as she navigated narrow passages between tangled roots and murky pools. In the distance, sporadic gunfire punctuated the humid air. Through her earpiece, she could hear the desperate coordination of medical evacuations and suppressive fire attempts. 2 more wounded at Charlie, crackled a voice she recognized as Staff Sergeant Martinez. "We can't locate the shooter's position." Genesis paused, orienting herself using a cypress stand she'd mapped months earlier. The primary sniper would be approximately 800 meters northwest, positioned on elevated ground with clear sightlines to both checkpoints. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Patience separates hunters from the hunted." Moving with the silent efficiency she'd perfected in the Pyrenees, she advanced through terrain others found impassable. Where larger marines would sink or stumble, she glided, her olive skin and dark eyes hidden beneath carefully arranged camouflage. Each meter gained was a tactical victory, bringing her closer to the enemy positions while remaining invisible. Genesis Rodriguez settled into position, her body perfectly still, despite the swamp water soaking through her camouflage suit. Through her scope, she could make out the first enemy sniper, 847 meters away, a distance that would intimidate most marksmen, but not her. The hostile target was partially concealed behind a fallen cypress, his rifle barrel barely visible as he continued to pin down the Marines at Checkpoint Charlie. She keyed her communication device. "Command, this is Rodriguez. I have eyes on primary target, requesting permission to engage." Captain Morrison's voice crackled through immediately. "Negative, Rodriguez. Return to base now. That's a direct order." Genesis took a deep breath, weighing 6 months of frustration against a lifetime of military discipline. The distant crack of enemy fire and the pained shouts of wounded Marines made her decision clear. "Sir, I'm taking the shot." She exhaled slowly, her finger caressing the trigger of her precision rifle. The world narrowed to her scope, the target, and the space between them. Wind speed, humidity, bullet drop, calculations her grandfather had taught her to make instinctively flowed through her mind. Genesis squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. 800 meters away, the enemy sniper slumped forward. "Target 1 neutralized," she reported calmly. "Already moving." No skilled marksman stayed in position after revealing their location. The communications specialist crawled through murky water, ignoring the leeches and water moccasins that made the swamp their home. She relocated 200 meters east, setting up her second firing position with practiced efficiency. The second target was more cautious, firing intermittently from a dense thicket near the water's edge. Genesis waited, patient as a hunter. When the enemy shifted position, exposing his shoulder, she took her shot. The bullet found its mark. "Target 2 down," she reported, her voice betraying no emotion. The third sniper proved the most challenging. Having heard his companions go silent, he'd taken cover in an abandoned hunting blind. Genesis maneuvered through the swamp, mud caking her olive skin as she closed the distance to 600 meters. The angle was poor, the shot nearly impossible. She waited 4 excruciating minutes until he made his mistake, a quick adjustment of position that gave her a clear shot. Her fingers squeezed the trigger one final time. "All targets neutralized," she reported. "Area secure." In the command center, stunned silence greeted her transmission. 6 minutes from first shot to last, and the crisis that had threatened to cost a dozen Marine lives was over. "Copy that," Morrison finally responded. "Return to base, Corporal." Genesis began the long trek back, knowing she'd saved her fellow Marines but violated every protocol to do it. Whatever consequences awaited, she had finally shown what the radio girl could do. The radio crackled with Genesis Rodriguez's calm voice. "Targets neutralized, area secure." At Checkpoint Charlie, the sudden silence was almost as shocking as the gunfire had been. Wounded Marines, who moments before had been pinned down with no hope of evacuation, were quickly loaded onto waiting vehicles. Medical teams rushed forward, applying pressure to bleeding wounds and administering morphine to those who needed it most. Genesis emerged from the swamp like a specter, her ghillie suit dripping with murky water and vegetation. She methodically broke down her sniper rifle, her movements precise, despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. The communications specialist knew what awaited her back at base. Court-martial was the minimum she could expect for such flagrant disregard of orders. As she approached the maintenance gate, Staff Sergeant Martinez stood waiting. The seasoned Marine's expression was unreadable as he escorted her silently through the compound. Personnel stopped and stared as she passed, whispers following in her wake. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with confusion about how the radio girl had transformed into a deadly ghost. In her quarters, Genesis carefully stowed her equipment and changed into a clean uniform. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the precision shooting, but from the weight of what would come next. She straightened her collar, took a deep breath, and made her way to Captain Morrison's office. The tribunal was already assembled. Morrison, Major Hawkins, and Lieutenant Colonel Bradford seated behind a table that seemed to grow more imposing since her last appearance before them. The air conditioning hummed quietly as she stood at attention, her compact frame rigid with military discipline. "Specialist Rodriguez," Captain Morrison began, his voice stern but lacking the anger she'd expected. "Your actions today violated direct orders, compromised operational security protocols, and undermined the chain of command." Major Hawkins leaned forward. "You abandoned your post, accessed unauthorized equipment, and engaged enemy combatants without clearance." Genesis maintained her posture, eyes fixed forward. "Yes, sir." Lieutenant Colonel Bradford studied her with calculating eyes. "You also eliminated 3 enemy snipers with extraordinary precision, prevented further casualties, and demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness. The fact remains," Morrison continued, "that you've created a dangerous precedent. We can't have personnel deciding individually when to follow orders and when to disregard them." Genesis finally spoke. "I understand the consequences, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions." Genesis Rodriguez stood at attention, her face betraying no emotion as she awaited her fate. The 3 officers had deliberated for hours, weighing her insubordination against the undeniable fact that her actions had saved numerous lives. "Specialist Rodriguez," Morrison began, his tone measured, "your unauthorized deployment violated at least 7 protocols." He paused, making eye contact with the young Marine. "However, your exceptional marksmanship and tactical awareness prevented further casualties and neutralized a threat our conventional methods couldn't address." Instead of the dishonorable discharge she had feared, Genesis received a formal reprimand alongside something unexpected, a promotion to corporal and transfer to Marine Special Operations Command for specialized training. Major Hawkins explained that her skills were too valuable to waste, while Lieutenant Colonel Bradford added that sometimes the Corps needed to recognize talent that didn't fit standard categories. 6 months later, Corporal Rodriguez stood before 20 Marines at Camp Lejeune, demonstrating camouflage techniques she'd perfected in the Pyrenees and adapted to various terrains. The same skills once dismissed as irrelevant were now being taught to elite operators preparing for high-risk missions. "Movement matters more than position," Genesis explained, her voice confident as she addressed Marines who towered over her. "Your breathing pattern should match natural rhythms of the environment." The students, many of whom had heard about the ghost of Evergreen, listened with rapt attention. Staff Sergeant Martinez, now serving as her assistant instructor, watched with newfound respect. He had been among her harshest critics at the base, but witnessing her precision under pressure had transformed his perspective. "I've never seen anyone move through terrain like Corporal Rodriguez," he told the class. "What she lacks in size, she makes up for in technique." The transformation extended beyond her personal journey. The Corps itself had begun reevaluating how it identified and developed unconventional talents. A new reconnaissance training program incorporated methods Genesis had pioneered, and communication specialists were now included in tactical exercises previously reserved for combat roles. In the officers' mess that evening, Captain Morrison shared a table with Genesis for the first time. "You know," he said, "sometimes the system needs someone to challenge it to evolve." The young corporal nodded, thinking of all the invisible barriers she had faced. "Sir, I just wanted to contribute what I could," she replied. Morrison smiled. "And now you're helping us see what we've been missing." He raised his glass in a subtle toast. "To the ghosts among us." Genesis's journey from overlooked radio specialist to valued instructor had come full circle, proving that determination and preparation could overcome any limitation others might imagine, and sometimes change an entire institution in the process.